What I'm going to do is to take you through some thoughts about how to set up organizations. So I hope you will join me in that. The question I'm really having is how can you set up an organization where it's possible to seek with Agile? About a year ago, I found this in a Danish newspaper. It's interesting in itself. It's about a Danish law firm who changed away from financial performance goals into a more soft set of measures that they're going to evaluate all their partners on. It's not something you would normally expect from this part of the business. But something is really happening in a sense that you cannot just keep going by the old ways. If you want to be successful as a knowledge organization working with Agile, you need to do things a bit different. And this is a very good example. So the questions I have today on top of the key questions, how can you build an organization to succeed with Agile, is actually, are there things you can choose to believe in that can change your luck favorably? Does it even make sense to think like this? And then finally, and I'm not going to answer this for you, but then finally the question, of course, is what should you choose to believe in? So this is what this is about. But before we go here, you need to ask yourself, why is this even interesting? And there is a dark side of things. And for some time I have had fun just picking up little pieces of evidence that maybe you really need to think about how you are doing things. So what often surprises people is that a lot of companies suffer from overload. There is simply too much stuff to do. Most of us are really, really bad at executing. So we are good at making strategies and plans, but we are really bad at actually implementing them. And then finally, and this is where a lot of people have an hard edge, is most ideas are really, really bad. So most of the ideas you have are actually not that good. Let's have a look at each of them one at a time. This screen is really big when you're standing here. So overload. Maybe you recognize some of this. Stress is an increasing thing in the daily workplace. I'm sure you have all heard about this. At least I have some colleagues who suddenly disappear, and then you ask what's going on, and they have stress. It's increasing everywhere, just as a symptom. Then I picked this up a few weeks ago from LinkedIn. It's just a fact. This survey claimed that 62% of us knowledge workers going to work feel disrespected. Not regularly, but actually every day. So every day, 62% of people like us, well, maybe not this room, but in general, go to work and feel disrespected. If you then look at how many organizations actually suffer from overload, the numbers are really, really high. You can try to Google it, and something has been changing. So when I was a kid going to school, you were not really, well, actually Google didn't exist. And then later, it was not allowed to use Google and the internet for facts in assignments. But today, Google knows everything. So if you ask Google, it will give you numbers like this, 90 to 80%. And then something I picked up from Don Reinerson's class is basically, if you don't know what your load is, and this is my own interpretation, but if you work in a company and you don't know what your load is, you can safely assume that it's much, much higher than what you can cope with. Then the next thing is about poor execution. So most of the organizations we build are supposed to actually support us in what we are doing. What you sometimes find, I don't know if you have tried this, but what you sometimes find is that actually the organization who is supposed to support you is working more against you than with you. It causes some interesting phenomena. One thing you can try to play with is to talk about the black market for common sense. So what you can say is that in all systems that doesn't make sense, clever people will try to work against the system. So you have what you could call a black market for common sense. And it's a very interesting conversation to have with your colleagues to try to see, okay, so what are the types of things that we actually try to do sort of outside the system? it can be all sorts of strange things. For example, if you have some financial limits in your travel policies, it could be things like every individual needs to pay a share of some larger expense so that it goes under the radar. It can be many, many strange things. Try look for them. Another good source of inspiration is a recent book which is called The Stupidity Paradox. And it's very, very interesting because it talks about all types of stupidity you meet in the workplace, but it also says that actually a bit of stupidity is necessary. Some of the previous speakers talked about alignment, and essentially as a larger group, it's not possible to get alignment unless some of us give up a little bit on what we actually believe in. So in a way, you need to be stupid to get to that. But trust me, there's more in that gold pot. Then the next thing, and this is in a sense my personal favorite, is about the bad ideas. It's something I picked up from a book called Innovation as Usual. But essentially what that book helps you understand is that most of the things we work on are maybe not as good as they could be. And if you look into some popular numbers again from Google, it will tell you things like 50% of all the software we develop is never actually used. And that's not scope you cut on the way to release. It's actually stuff that has been released. So you have been speccing it and coding it and testing it and fixing it and everything. And then all the way through the pipeline to the end users and not really used. 70% of projects fails. That number has been consistent for the last 30 years. 90% of startups fails is the claim from the lean startup, and you can go on and on and on. Like Mel, I also attended Tom's Gilb Fest this summer, and one of the speakers said that the number for failing transformations is even higher than the number for failing projects, so I put it here. The speaker actually mentioned 90%, but I haven't been able to get the source, but still, it's amazing how many of the things we do on an ongoing basis that never actually turn out well. So just to paint the dark side for you, and really what this is all about is the survivability. If you want to know more about that, David Anderson put it excellently in his free agendas of Kanban, where he talks about sustainability. That's about acceptable conditions for you and me, service delivery, getting things done, and survivability, which is the strategic ambition of any company to survive on a longer going basis. Anyway, back to the fun part. So what I'm really asking is, can you choose to believe something that will change your luck favorably? Does it at all make sense to think like this? And if so, what should you choose to believe in? And I'm going to ask a little bit of help for you on the first part, because you're the only ones who can actually do this. So we're going to have an example. Do any of you know who this guy is? Richard Branson. Good, the guy in the middle. I have no idea who the two other guys are. So actually I'm sure he has this army of people who is writing cool stuff for him on LinkedIn. Obviously some of it is coming from him, but he has a lot of good things and I like to pick from it. This is a recent example. So what he said is that if you take good care of your employees, and then how would you continue this sentence? Customers, take good care of your business. So exactly, you're right. So they will take good care of your business. This is just meant as an example. For some time I used a similar example where he said that the most important thing is people, 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 or the three most important things are people, people, people. So the point is that the world is full of these examples. So what I'm asking from you now is just please, and maybe you can share pencil sharpeners and stuff while you do this, but please just take a minute discussing with a guy next to you. If you were the ones to set up like the perfect agile organization as whatever role you have, what would be the fundamental things that you would take into that? What would be the things that you would choose to believe in order to increase your likelihood of success? So please take a minute, and then we're just going to pick a few examples from what you discuss, but please help me discuss with the person next to you. And if you don't have a person next to you, you are full of a room with people with the same problem. So please find someone. Just a minute. What would you pick? Okay, thanks a lot for taking the challenge. So anyone who likes to share a few examples of what you discussed? I will repeat if you just speak a little bit loud. So what type of examples did you come up with in your conversation? People have good intentions. That's a good one. Anything else you would throw into the bag?
Don't be afraid to make decisions.
Don't be afraid to make decisions. Thank you. One more. Don't be afraid to experiment. Thank you. So thanks a lot for helping with this. And I think if we had gone through the whole room, we would have a very long list of these. I'm going to share my favorite list in the end. But the next question I have is that, does it really make sense to think like this? And a few years ago, I came across this, which I really like, that culture in a company is defined by the things that you are not talking about. And I really don't mean to sort of define or go into the cultural discussion. I just think it's very interesting, this statement that culture is defined by the things you are not talking about. What I have heard my whole career is that culture is among the most difficult things to actually work with and change. But if this is really true, that culture is defined by what you are not talking about, how can you change culture? Start talking about something else, right? If you start talking about other things than you talk about now, then the culture will change. It might not change the way you want it to change, but at least it's a handle on that fuzzy culture thing. And I didn't mean anything deeper than that. Then there's another one, which I picked up from Management 3.0. It comes from a philosopher called Levin. So it says that behavior is a function of both an individual or a team and the environment of that individual. So basically there is two things to behavior. It's a person and the environment of the person. Also, I have learned that persons are really, really difficult to change. So if you like to see a behavioral change in someone for good or bad reasons, it seems like you have two options. You can work with the person or you can work with the environment. Just to give an example of this, is in a relationship, it's not uncommon that one spouse would like to change the other. So using what we have just learned, if one spouse wants to change another, what would be the most effective strategy to go about that? You're actually onto something. So someone is saying divorce here. And this is exactly my conclusion as well, that if you want to change another person, then you yourself would be the environment around the person in which you would like him or her to change. So the most effective way to change your spouse is to give your spouse another spouse, which I'm not sure this is useful, but I hope it illustrates the point. Another very good example is something you can call freedom through structure. So traffic rules is a very good example of that. So the fact that we have traffic rules, in most countries at least, allow most of us to drive with more freedom and flexibility. And again, if you are looking to create the right environment, it actually can give you huge degrees of freedom. One example I'm sometimes using is a discussion between a thing like test-driven development or continuous integration. So assume that you would try to evaluate which is a better one. And long story short, I would argue that continuous integration is a structure-driven change. It's the environment, whereas a test-driven development is more as a behavioral change, which might be a little bit difficult to get on top of. Final example on the environment thing. Let me get this right. So if you look at this curve and have stress on this dimension and freedom on this dimension, then most of us would intuitively think that the more freedom you have, the less stress you have. And that's also how it is in many cases. A Danish psychologist, Signe, did her PhD investigating stress in public organizations in Denmark. And she found out something very, very amazing. So she actually found out that with the wrong kind of freedom, your stress level would go up. So people like us, if we have wrong kind of freedom, we actually get more stressed than if we have less freedom. So there seems to be a sweet spot you can call relative structure. And the interesting thing about this curve is that you can have better or worse situations, but the curve doesn't change its shape. And I would say that this is in a way almost like empowerment 2.0. It used to be so that you would be giving a role and responsibility and you would be supposed to feel that. But with a curve like this, what you really need to be aware is that as a knowledge worker, you need to take responsibility for your own situation and you need to negotiate the relevant degrees of freedom in any given situation. Anyway, the last thing, so I'm just sharing a few things which has helped me think about this. And this is maybe not so serious, but for many years I have been playing golf and I always heard this quote, which I thought came from Jack Nicklaus, but Google claims it comes from Gary Player, so I choose to believe that. But it's anyway saying that the more you practice, or the more I practice, the luckier I get. So what I claim is that you can actually push your luck in a favorable direction. And here's a very concrete example. It's from my days in Nokia. It was the first video phone. It was called Kenny because it refused to die. So there was a number of sequences of this program. But anyway, I was discussing with the head of R&D and the program manager about testing. And I had to come up with an example to illustrate to them that it really made sense to invest in planning your testing ahead of the development. So we came up with this simple model where you can say, this is the sequence of errors you find and fix in a worst case scenario. And this is the sequence of errors you find and fix in a best case scenario. And now I don't remember, but somebody said we had like orders of magnitude here. And what we talked about was an expected number of errors of 20,000 for one single phone program. So it was really significant. But anyway, there's a huge difference in the order in which you can find and fix these. So the question would be, how could you push, in a way, the likelihood of a favorable outcome in the right direction? And the conversation we had was very simple. It means that you early make a test strategy that even influence the order in which you develop and integrate your program. I'm not sure how successful we were with this in the concrete case, but for me this was also always a very good example of how you actually, by making a strategy and thinking about likely outcomes, can push your luck in a more favorable direction. That's the end of sort of looking into the question, does it really make sense to think like this? So I hope you somehow was able to follow the logic. And the last question, which is left and where you helped a little bit to share what you would choose to believe in, is simply, what are the things then that you should choose to believe in? And also here, I have had some fun just to collect things. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to let you have a look at this. I can pick a few myself, but maybe if there's one or two you want to go into, we can go a little bit into that. So please pick one and let's talk about it. And I promise we will finish in time for lunch, but it's of course your risk. Anything that sort of jump in your eye? Except that most ideas are bad. That's a really good one, and I already commented a bit on this. So what you can say is that it's a bit like testing. So with testing, you can never prove that a system is working. You can only prove that it's not working, and it's a little bit the same with ideas. You can never really prove that an idea is good, but you can actually prove that it's a bad one. So if you think back on this dark side of things I presented to you, then I would claim that a lot of the problems we see there is coming from the fact that we are very bad at seeing that our ideas are bad. So we are simply too slow in finding out how bad these ideas are. So the way we can use a belief like this, most ideas are bad, is that we will continuously look at the things we are working on and challenge ourselves to make sure that it's the right thing. And you find this thing very deep in lean startup, for example, I would say it's all about that, the idea of the minimum viable product and the constant circle of experimenting and testing. My favorite example here is from a Danish investment fund. So they had been working with 2 large Danish companies. One of them burned 500 million Danish crowns, which is about 50,000 pounds or something like that. But anyway, a lot of money on their internal projects. And all of these programs, a handful, actually failed. So they just didn't get any results at all. Then the counterexample was another company that worked with a startup funnel. So instead of sort of going deep in on internal projects, they microfunded a number of startups. So for a price of 5 million Danish crowns, which is 100 times less, they worked with a handful of startups to produce results that you can just, by a rough assessment, say they were at least 100 times better. So the difference between these 2 cases is a factor of 10,000. It's like 100 times better results for 100 times less money. A little bit like the bridge we saw in Alistair's presentation. So if you choose to believe that most ideas are bad, it can actually do small wonders for you. Any other examples you like to go into? Excuse me? Steal with pride. This time I heard the first time from Tom, so he attributed it to Tom Gilb, so he attributed it to Ericsson, who always said, steal with pride. And I found the same thing in the book I mentioned earlier, Innovation as Usual. And I think you should have no moral trouble stealing good ideas from others. It's probably the best you can do. They are most likely better than your own. So it's really like, don't be ashamed to take from others what they do well and apply it to your own benefit. Last one. Okay, I have one myself, which is this one, follow the work. Recently I've been reflecting a lot about this. I'm now on a program that is doing IT replacement. So if you are replacing one old system with a new system, there's just a lot of things that you have to do. And in that process, we want to be agile. But it's not agile as normal, because normally when you do agile, you're in this very chaotic environment where you only know when you act and react on what you learn. So you need to be very, very careful what you do. But actually, when you do IT replacement, there's a lot of work you predictably know that you have to do. So if you go about that in a way that you pretend that you don't know, you're set up for trouble. So basically, if you do like legacy work or IT replacement work, a lot of the things that you in another setting would have to learn the hard way are discoverable. So the interesting question is that if you choose to believe that the work is laid out for you and you can actually work with that, it guides you in a different way than if you somehow assume that anything can happen at any given point in time. I think of this as advice from the cheap criminal movies from the US, where when everything goes wrong in the investigation, there's always this clever guy who's like pulling out his cigarette or having a sip of his coffee and say, hey, let's try follow the money. And in a similar way, I'm saying here, if everything else fails in your setting and it doesn't really work, then it's like, hey, let's try to follow the real work. Thank you very much.